Isaac Clarke has survived 2 clashes with the necromorph nightmare, but he has not escaped unscathed. The horrors he's witnessed have scarred the deepest parts of his soul. He's drowning in the depths of his experiences, and the surface seems far away. His girlfriend, Ellie Langford, lost all patience in him, but more importantly, she's lost all hope. She left him, and he is left alone to hide from EarthGov for his transgressions against the system. The isolation in his apartment is suddenly broken when 2 soldiers break in at gunpoint. He learns that Ellie is in trouble. She's on a mission involving the markers and needs his help. Isaac has a choice. Help the one attachment he has left in this universe, albeit one that rejected him, or accept his fate as a man destined to skulk in the shadows alone for the rest of his life. The decision is simple. Isaac can't leave Ellie in the lurch. It's time to suit up in a combat rig, one last time. You are Isaac Clarke, and this is Dead Space 3. Hey, what's up everybody? My name is Kelvin B. Fisher, author of the Northfield Saga and game enthusiast. Together we've explored Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2, 2 modern masterpieces of action, horror, and environmental storytelling. And now we're on to Dead Space 3, the black sheep of the little Dead Space family. Man, from what I've seen, people really hate this game. In my time writing retrospectives, I've dabbled in the Dead Space forums, and people treat this game like a scourge. People, most it seems, go as far as to wish that this game never existed. And I feel like that's a big thing to say, that you want something just blotted off the face of the earth. The reasons for this animosity are numerous, but they all come down to the same general cause. The charge that Dead Space 3 is a casualization of the series, an attempt to nudge up against the infamous general audience demographic, and in the process, lose everything that's special about the Dead Space series. Dead Space 3 was left to husk, a generic shooter with little to differentiate it from something like Gears of War or Ghost Recon. A focus was put into co-op, sacrificing the experience of single-player gamers in a series primarily focused on single-player. In fact, many go so far as to say the experience is incomplete if you play alone. But perhaps most of all, this game is charged with killing the Dead Space series, or at least putting it in a cryogenic hold until the recent remake. The animosity for this game is so strong that, back when it released, it scared me away from playing. I had just really started getting into shooters back then, and Dead Space 3 looked really visually appealing to me. So much so that I wanted to play it even though I hadn't played the prior games in the series, and wasn't really a fan of horror games. But then I caught wind of the hatred. Principally, the claim that the experience was locked away unless you wanted to play with a co-op buddy. At the time, I really didn't want to play co-op, so I stayed away. To be honest, out of the 3 Dead Space games, this is the one I look most forward to reviewing, just for that reason. So far, I've had pretty standard takes on the prior games. I thought Dead Space 1 and 2 were classic, which lines up with what most people think. Same goes for the remake, which I thought was great, like most people. I still think I have some salient and interesting points to make in those videos, so watch them if you haven't yet. Still, I can't say I went full contrarian with them. With that pattern in mind, I figured Dead Space 3 would follow suit. I think it was a pretty weak entry, dunk on it a little bit, and go about with my next video. Well, I was wrong. Dead Space 3 might be, in my opinion, one of the most overhated games I've ever played. I gotta say, I had an absolute ball with this game, and I can't get behind some of the criticisms that people have for the game. Or at least I think some of them are a bit overblown. Plus, it feels like people completely write over everything this game does well, because there are a lot of things I think it does amazingly. This one might ruffle some feathers, as you can guess. Well, I think we should just kick things off then. There's going to be spoilers in this video, so if that bothers you, I'd tune out and come back another time. Let's start off with the main story. Right off the rip, Dead Space 3 starts off by doing something that neither predecessor did, playing as a character other than Isaac. We start off playing a grunt soldier on a frozen planet, which looks a little too close to Minnesota winters for my liking. We start off as this bright-eyed, slightly dough-faced soldier as he tries to retrieve a codex. I forget his name, but to be entirely honest, it doesn't matter much, because he dies as soon as he gets the codex and returns it to his general. The general promotes him by a bullet through the noggin, then gives the same executive treatment to himself. Clearly there's a cover-up going on, but we don't get a chance to learn about it more quite yet. We're transported to a bustling city where we take the shoes of Isaac once more, where we'll be comfortably settled for the rest of the game. Isaac is listening to a voicemail left by Ellie Langford, fellow Sprawl survivor, then girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend. The last two are a bit jarring, because Isaac and Ellie's relationship doesn't extend past the platonic by the end of the prior game. There isn't really that much flirting between them that I can recall, which is all fair to be clear. They're trying to escape a souped-up zombie horde. There is no time for love letter exchanges or double entendres. And to be even more fair, the game sets up Ellie as a replacement for Nicole, just by her sheer proximity to Nicole and her role in the story. Isaac sending Nicole away to keep her safe, which is exactly what he wished he could have done for Nicole, implicitly connects the two there. So it doesn't come entirely out of left field. Still, all that is to say it's a bit jarring to have Isaac and her get together off-screen, then break up off-screen too. It feels a little whiplashy, but it isn't that big of a deal. Moving on. Isaac's pouting is quickly broken up by the appearance of two soldiers that break into his place. They are Robert Norton and Sergeant John Carver. They ask for Isaac's help in destroying the marker. Isaac's a bit of a bitter pill after everything that's happened, and he tells them to go stuff themselves. Norton reveals that they did send someone else on the mission, Ellie. They lost contact with her though. Their conversation is interrupted by an explosion. Unitologists are attacking. Unitologists are a crazy religious faction who believe that the markers and necromorphs are the key to ascension through death. What this results in is the Unitologists doing everything in their power to help the necromorph invasion spread and kill people, which is coincidentally exactly what they're doing right now. Isaac decides to help, for Ellie's sake. What follows is a frantic escape from the city. Isaac gets strapped and starts capping Unitologists' heads, who do everything in their power to stop him. Direct combat with humans is a new feature for this series, but I'll talk more about that later. Along the way, we get our first glimpse of the main antagonist of the game, Danik. He's the ringleader of the Unitologists, a charismatic man who seems pretty well put together until you think for just 1 second about how crazy his beliefs are. Shortly after, we meet Danik in person, but Isaac doesn't get a chance to ask him for an autograph. He swiftly unleashes the marker, which starts another wave of necromorph invasions. Isaac gets away, but now he has to contend with the necromorph horde yet again. Isaac battles his way through the city in order to reconvene with Norton and Carver. Eventually he does so, and the three very unmerry musketeers journey on their way to find Ellie. Let's take a quick breather from summarizing the plot and analyze it. I want to stress how all of this has happened in the first 30 minutes of the game. This is a lot to happen in 30 minutes. It's hard for me to think of a plot that moves faster than Dead Space 3 up to this point. I mean, let's quickly take stock of everything that's happened. We have a prologue. We learn Isaac and Ellie dated, then broke up. Two guys break into Isaac's place and hold him hostage. Unitologists attack. Isaac encounters the bad guy. The bad guy unleashes the marker. The necromorph invasion ensues. Isaac escapes. Isaac makes his way through the city and narrowly escapes again. All this in 30 minutes. It's just too much happening, so quick all at once. Especially if you have no prior knowledge of the series. You're going to be more than a little lost here. I get why the game is trying to shuttle us through all this stuff so quick. They want to get the intro stuff out of the way, and don't want to spend a whole lot of time meandering on things like another necromorph outbreak happening. Still, it's just too much whiplash. Luckily, the game slows down a bit from here on out. So, the plot nearly broke my neck, but what about the characters? Well, they start off really strong. Isaac's motivations are understandable and easy to empathize with. You get why he distrusts Norton and Carver given his past, yet you obviously get why he's working with them. The voice acting and dialogue are really convincing here. I think that's one of the highlights for me so far. The dialogue is really snappy and well written. Norton gets some of the best lines so far, and his banter with him and Isaac is entertaining. This really is the first time you have a truly antagonistic relationship between Isaac and one of his allies, and it's a good dynamic. In fact, Norton is one of my favorite characters in the series so far, which, if you played the game, you probably find funny. Norton is probably the most hated character in this series, and he deserves that reputation, but we'll get to that later. Carver's a jerk, but he doesn't get much screen time at this point, so I'll give it a pass. Danik has a lot of charisma, and his dialogue is also really well written, but he doesn't do much to really differentiate between him and the other villains in the series like Chalice Mercer. He's a nutty unitologist with the same nutty ideas, even if it's dressed up a bit differently. However, it's just the start, so I'll keep an open mind. We'll discuss him more as the game plays out. So overall, it's a strong start with some pretty strong writing, even if the pacing is pretty out of whack. I'm hooked at this point. Let's continue. Isaac, Norton, and Carver travel to the location of Ellie's last transmission. They find themselves in the orbit of a planet with a derelict ship also in orbit. Their own ship gets some dings and bruises along the way and is left in disrepair. Isaac makes his way through the derelict ship, restoring some of its functions and fighting long-toothed necromorphs along the way. Eventually, Isaac reunites with the crew. Ellie's among them, surprisingly unharmed. For a series with so much horror and tragedy, this is welcome news. It's followed with some very unwelcome news, because Isaac learns that Norton is actually in a relationship with Ellie. Wow, she rebounded pretty darn quickly. That explains why Norton was particularly passionate about finding her. Norton keeping this a secret from Isaac up until now makes sense. He wants Isaac's help saving her. If Isaac learned that they were shacking up together, he may have turned his back on the whole enterprise. This deception speaks to Norton's character and is a nice way of nodding towards flaws which manifest more later. It's a subtle piece of character work which I appreciate. Nonetheless, this is the point that a lot of Dead Space fans start to groan. A love triangle in Dead Space? Many fans write it off entirely just on that concept alone, but let's give it some time to play out before coming to judgments. One thing I will say so far is that it adds to our sympathy for Isaac. The guy's just getting screwed over left and right. The fact that he continues on, helping people even though he's a bit grumpy about it, really makes it easier to root for him. I think out of the entire series, this is the point where I was most actively rooting for Isaac Clarke as a character, and things to go his way. Ellie has a potential lead. The captain of the ship left marker inscriptions in her room. Isaac's able to read these markers, so he goes to find out what they say. The captain scribbled a message about a machine that can control the markers, most importantly, that they can be shut off. The device is on a frozen surface of the planet we've been orbiting. It coincidentally is the same planet that the game's prologue took place in, where an unfortunate soldier got a dime-sized hole in his cranium. Our team is at a decision point. Do they take their ship and escape into the void of space? Or do they descend into the dangers of the planet's surface and try to find the device to save humanity? Norton is more on board with dipping out and letting someone else deal with the problem. Even though humanity's in the throes of extinction, somebody else will come along, right? Ellie and Isaac don't think so. They vote on heading down to the planet. If humanity dies, then there isn't much point in their escape, now is there? Sounds perfectly logical to me, and the others. Not so much to Norton. You think Isaac's just siding with Ellie because he wants to get back with her. Which maybe is true enough, but I mean, two things can be true at the same time, right? Ellie and Isaac's argument wins out among the party. And so, the team heads down to the planet's surface, and they have a bit of a rocky landing. Isaac is separated from the rest of the team. Norton decides to write him off as dead, which sounds a little bit of a nice coincidence for him, but Ellie isn't so ready to write him off. She leaves Isaac flares in the snow, which he can use to return to the other survivors. Along the way, Isaac fights off necromorphs, who threaten the survivors just as much as the cold. In short order though, Isaac and the band learn that they and the necromorphs aren't the only occupants of this island. That's right, Danik and the boys are here to make sure convergence happens. Convergence is the final stage of the necromorph outbreak. Now we've really entered the wild goose chase. Isaac and company are trying to find the marker off switch, while the unitologists are trying to kill them first. Isaac and his buddies go about their mission, fighting off unitologists and necromorphs alike. All along the way, Norton complains and urges everyone to give up the game and find a way off the planet instead. He's also growing increasingly hostile towards Isaac and accusing him and Ellie of getting too close to one another. Ellie and Isaac try to keep cool heads, remaining focused on the mission. You know, as you probably would be too if all of humanity was at stake. Norton eventually locks Isaac in an elevator, leaving him for dead, which takes Isaac all of 2 seconds to unlock. Real great effort there, Norton. When Isaac confronts Norton on his mild attempt to kill him, he and Carver learn that Norton's intentions were even worse than they thought. Danik captures them. Norton's been feeding Danik info the entire time. Danik captures them. Norton's been feeding Danik info the entire time. Where to find the planet, where they were, etc. He did this betrayal, all in the bid that he and the other survivors could get off the planet safely. Danik reneges on the deal, planning on killing Norton instead. You might be starting to see why people hate Norton so much, but let me elaborate. First off, ever since he and Ellie's relationship is revealed, he starts acting like a petulant child, worried that Isaac is going to steal off with Ellie. Meanwhile, Isaac and Ellie are being reasonable about the whole thing, not flying off the handle with Norton or being unreasonable. It's a shame, because I honestly think his character started off pretty strong at the beginning of the game. He had a snarky jerk charisma which seems to have dissipated. Secondly, his attempt to kill Isaac is poorly thought out to say the least. I mean, this is evident since Isaac could get himself out of this situation in 2 seconds. If Norton had meant to kill Isaac, he should have just gone and put a bullet in Isaac's head. Leaving him to die, and dies in air quotes, with nothing to stop Isaac but a rusty gate is more than a little questionable. I mean, you're leaving the possibility for Isaac to escape wide open. And what happens if he returns to the team? He's going to cause you a world of hurt. either by killing you or convincing the others that you're a degenerate. You're definitely going to lose Ellie in that case, which is who he's so desperately trying to keep in the first place. Lastly, past this blunder, Norton's decision to feed unitologists information is brain dead. The unitologists are a psychotic cult. Why would he think they would make good on any promises when their goal is effectively the extinction of the human race? Furthermore, he gets almost nothing out of the deal when you think about it. All he gets is him and his buddies' lives spared. Well, if you hadn't invited them to the planet, then they wouldn't have had to spare your lives, now would they? It's like calling a murdering robber and giving him free reign in your house with the promise that he wouldn't kill you. I mean, how would that make any sense? Well, it's good for Mr. Norton that Isaac's such a stand-up guy. When Danik tries to kill Norton, Isaac dives in to spare his life. It's a class act move, honestly, and it makes me like Isaac more. It's a true heroic moment in a series that has been so focused on survival rather than heroics. Isaac has to contend with the Nexus. Afterwards, Norton isn't too gracious for the save. He blames Isaac for everything, even though he could probably trace back almost all of the mistakes to his own hands. Yeah, nothing says a born leader like blaming everyone else for your mistakes. Isaac kills Norton in self-defense. The group of survivors has shrunk down to 4 people: Isaac, Carver, Ellie, and Santos. They're all pretty dejected by this, especially Santos, who has a breakdown. The group resolves to continue on. At the top of the mountain lies a lab which contains information they can use to advance their mission. They start to climb the mountain. Ellie's angry at Isaac for killing Norton, even though Carver backs him up in saying that Isaac acted in self-defense. On this point, I'm a bit torn. Sure, Ellie's being a bit unreasonable in blaming Isaac, but at the same time, he did put a cap through her boyfriend's cranium. I think it makes sense for her to be a bit ticked off, regardless of the context. Calamity ensues. Santos gets trapped in an elevator when a necromorph monster attacks. Isaac does his best to save her. Carver's worried that the monster will take down the entire cliff wall, so he cuts the cage loose. Let's just ignore Ellie just chilling in the background. Santos falls to her death. Isaac wastes no time in killing the snow beast. Now only Carver, Ellie, and Isaac are left. Sad news bears. Isaac works to reunite with Carver and Ellie, having separated from them while battling the beast. When they convene at the top of the mountain, with the lab in their sight, Isaac apologizes to Ellie and the two reconcile. It's a short moment, but given all of the tragedy and setbacks that have befallen Isaac and his comrades in such a short period of time, having something positive happen in this story really did lift my spirits. Isaac and the gang don't spend much time alone on the mountain. They're swiftly joined by Danik and his band of unitologists. It's shootout after shootout with them and the swift-moving Twitcher necromorphs as Isaac reassembles Rosetta. Rosetta is the body of an ancient alien with information about the necromorphs etched into her brain. It's a similar process to what happened to Isaac, where he has the ability to decipher text and receive visions. Speaking of visions, he receives one when Rosetta has been fully assembled. The vision reveals Rosetta's past. Her own race discovered a marker and fell victim to the same apocalyptic infection that humans are now facing. Past this, though, Isaac learns the true endgame of the infection, convergence. Once the necromorphs have reached a critical mass, the convergent event begins. The necromorphs coalesce into a moon, called a brethren moon. Once the moon has been formed, it broadcasts signals across the stars, influencing other civilizations to build their own markers using the same mind-influencing power that we've seen markers and necromorphs exhibit throughout the series. When this marker is triggered, it starts another infection, creating another brethren moon, and another cycle. These big moons are effectively large influenza viruses, transmitting this scourge across the universe. This story doesn't exactly end there for Rosetta and her people, however. They created a device which froze the necromorph invasion in its tracks, stopping the convergence event. That's why this planet is so frosty. There's some nice environmental storytelling to this effect too. Before this revelation, audio logs hint that this planet wasn't always frozen, rather an aquatic world, and the archaeological and geological evidence points to this planet getting flash frozen pretty quickly, faster than a naturally occurring ice age would indicate. Isaac and his allies' goal is clear: reactivate the device using the codex and stop the convergence. As soon as this vision ends, things take a turn for the worse. A first for this game. Danik and his unitologists appear, stealing the codex. After all, they want convergence to proceed, so naturally they want to stop Isaac and his pals from preventing it. Danik once again reveals himself to be incompetent in offing Isaac and the others, but he manages to escape the facility. The lab is plunged in gas. Isaac and Carver escape, but Ellie can't make it in time. The door closes, leaving Ellie to her death. Man, just when things were starting to look brighter for Isaac. This entire game, we've been doing everything for Ellie, and now those efforts are a vapor in our hands. Isaac is crushed. We're crushed. But, more importantly, we're angry. Danik with his smarmy attitude and ghoulish intentions are behind this. Isaac gets rageful and angry, and is the player right there behind him. It's a state we don't see Isaac in until this point. Angry, almost to the point of being out of control. Carver tells him to cool it. Since Carver's just about the flagship for anger, this is saying something. But as the player, I was right there with him. I wanted to get Danik and show him where he can stuff that codex. After a prolonged chase, Isaac recovers the codex, but he doesn't kill Danik. He cools his jets just a little bit. Isaac and Carver come across the device, and they share a short moment of reflection together. I really like this part. It humanized both characters, as Carver wonders whether everything was worth it. This moment does feel a bit strange, because it's only recently that the story had Isaac and Carver really start to see eye to eye. But here they act like war veterans together. My guess, or more accurately what I've heard, is that they get more development through the co-op missions. So, if you play the co-op missions, the progression of their relationship feels more natural. That's not an excuse for the single player though. I wish more had been spent on their relationship in the campaign. I feel like even one or two more of these exchanges between Isaac and Carver would have gone a long way towards making their transition from reluctant cooperators to battle-hardened buddies a bit more natural. Isaac and Carver continue on, battling their way through necromorphs and unitologists alike to activate the device. They reach the device and are met by Danik. But more than that, Ellie is alive. She escaped the gas, but she was swiftly captured by unitologists. Danik offers an exchange, the Codex for Ellie. Both Isaac and Ellie think the fate of the human race can't be bargained so easily, but Carver thinks differently. He hands the Codex to Danik, which, by the way, we should have learned by now that Danik doesn't honor deals, but whatever. Danik does give Ellie back before shutting off the device and resuming the resurgence. Danik gets unalived by a piece of falling debris, but our heroes still have an entire freaking moon to contend with. Ellie wants Isaac to escape, and Carver offers to stay alone, but Isaac knows he has to finish this. He kisses Ellie goodbye, and he and Carver set up shop to stop the moon. They battle through more necromorphs to get the codex back. This all culminates in a fight with the moon, where you chuck markers like makeshift spears at the moon monster's eyes. It's a pretty cool spectacle, I'll say that. After being plagued by these stupid markers for so long, it's nice to huck them at somebody. Isaac and Carver manage to stop the threat, but at the cost of their lives. The game ends with Ellie mourning Isaac before flying away from the planet, until we hear Isaac calling for her. Alright, that's the story. So, what do I think about it? In broad strokes, it's a story of highs and lows for me. It has the most spectacle of the series for sure, and the most immediacy to the plot. I like the characters overall, especially Isaac. People may disagree with me, but he came across the most human here in this game. He had his own wants, his own needs, his own foibles and shortcomings. He expresses a true care for other people, despite the hardened shell that's built around him from the events of the past two games. He's a scarred, battle-worn hero, and it was easy for me to root for him throughout. I think this is because in large part the game does a great job of always orienting the player's goals and objectives with Isaac's. Take Isaac's hunt for Danik near the end of the game. As the player, you feel the same anger that Isaac feels, and you want to take Danik down after he's caused you so much pain and inconvenience throughout the story. In addition, it's refreshing how reasonable Isaac acts throughout the game. Often with love triangles, characters act really unreasonably because of the writers forcing drama into scenes that wouldn't be happening if everyone acted reasonably. While for Isaac's part, he always acts like how an actual human being would. When the world is at stake, he isn't focused on squabbling with Norton to win over Ellie. That fight is brought to him. And at the end of the game, when the choice is between Ellie or the human race, the choice pains him but he doesn't hesitate. He chooses the human race. The same goes for Ellie, at least on the exterior. All of her actions throughout the game are understandable. She cares for Isaac and Norton both, but she isn't interested in relationship squabbles when the rest of humanity is burning. Of course, the same can't be said for all characters. We've already gone over how Norton is just wholly unreasonable. However, it's a game that you can really start to pick apart the logic and reasoning behind characters' choices if you look hard enough. For instance, as I mentioned earlier, when Carver makes the exchange for Ellie, based on Danik's history of betrayal, he should never have made that choice, especially since he isn't much of a softie himself. Even going back to Ellie, although her actions on the exterior are all reasonable, when you start really thinking through the story, you start to see some holes. I mean, she reconciles with Isaac very shortly after her boyfriend was killed. Like, in a span of hours. It's hours in real life when you're playing the game, so it feels like a long time. But in the game world, it's still only a couple of hours, so it's fairly contrived in that sense. Danik might be the most well-written out of all the Dead Space villains. He has tons of charisma, and all of his dialogue is engaging. However, as I talked about earlier, He's yet another unitologist baddie with the same outlook on life and the same goals. Aside from a voice change and character model switch, you could slot Chalice Mercer in from the first game as the antagonist and not much would be different. Although I noticed this early on, I gave the game more time to see if Danik would eventually stand out. Unfortunately, all I ended up getting from him was a sense of fatigue. I think part of the issue might be the unitologist faction itself. Because the faction is just so extreme and that they want the extinction of the human race for the purposes of ascension, you can really only have one type of villain lead that faction. There just isn't really any room for nuance, and that results in all the villains feeling the same. I think the writers had written themselves into a corner by this third game, and I think Danik was the best they could do. Still, if there ever is a Dead Space 4, I hope the developers move away from the unitologists in favor of another faction with a bit more interesting of motives. Carver is an interesting one. He's such a jerk at the beginning of the game, so unapologetically so, that I didn't have much of an opinion on him. I didn't hate him, but I certainly didn't like him. Sort of just disappears from the game though until near the end. His character seems to completely change at that point. He's still a jerk, but there's a lot more humanity to him, and he has a brotherhood with Isaac. After finishing the campaign, I disagree with the criticism that Dead Space 3's story is incomplete without playing the co-op missions. You get a complete story that is satisfying. All that save, however, for Carver. This is the one area where you feel that something is just missing. This gap in appearances, and then the son character change in closeness to Isaac is jarring to say the least. However, if you put that aside, I liked endgame Carver. I just wish we had more of this Carver throughout the rest of the game. Overall though, I honestly think I have to say I was most invested in Dead Space 3's story out of all the games. This may be due to this being the third entry in the series, and a lot of that investment had been built up from the other two games. I don't think that's the whole story, however. I think the development of the Necromorph lore and the Convergent event was genuinely interesting. I think the characters had a pop to them that surpassed other games, even though their characterization and decision making could be a bit inconsistent at times. Lastly, this Isaac was my favorite version of Isaac for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. I just had an easy time rooting for the guy, and I was invested in his success. I just wanted the best for him, and even though he didn't get it, I like this game as a culmination of its development from an engineer to a heroic figure who's doing everything he can to save people in a world being consumed. His guilt, his resentment towards the people responsible, yet his heroism was a compelling mix to me. So all that is why I have to say the game's story is a mixture of highs and lows. That has a lot of my favorite story moments in the series, but the writing can certainly be shaky at times. I suppose it comes down to your tolerance for plot holes and leaps of logic. They can be weird things at times. Sometimes certain plot holes can really bother me intensely, but none of the ones in Dead Space 3 really got to me all that severely. I guess it's a subjective thing and your mileage may vary. With all that being said, I thoroughly enjoyed the ride that Dead Space 3 gave us, and I do think its story is a worthy conclusion to the trilogy, warts and all. In this section of the video, I'm going to talk about the other storytelling aspects of Dead Space 3 aside from the main story. I'll be talking about the art design, atmosphere, immersion, and a bit about the side content in the game. The first two Dead Space games are some of the most immersive shooters that I've ever played. It was easy to gush and gush about how the visuals, scraps of lore, sound design, and etc. all come together to form a cohesive world that you are entrapped in. With Dead Space 3 though, I find myself struggling to find the right words to explain how I feel about the game. I think the reason why is because I think Dead Space 3 takes a different approach to these elements. In Dead Space 1 and 2, you would get lost in the small details. An audio log might immerse you with its impressive voice acting and content, the way the lights flicker in a dour hallway, or the way a body is laid out and tells a small story in of itself. These small details coalesce into building the world brick by brick. Dead Space 3's expression is grander, while Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 to a lesser extent confine you to hallways and corridors. Dead Space 3 is much more open. You're floating around in the orbit of a planet, able to travel across large expanses freely. You're trudging across a frozen wasteland with the wide open sky in your midst. I didn't find myself as lost in rummaging around audio tapes because the grandness of everything else absorbed me. There are 4 very distinct points in the game where I just froze and had to stop and take everything in. The vistas were so breathtaking and so absorbing. There aren't many games that make me do this even once. The fact that Dead Space 3 did it to me 4 times is astounding. The fact that a 10-year-old game could astound me like this with its visuals is a testament not only to the poly count, but the art design. In fact, this game reminded me of Destiny, which, in the art direction department, is about the highest compliment I can give a game. This observation may raise a few eyebrows. Destiny is a sci-fi game, sure, but it's also a fantasy game. Destiny is hardly scary, except maybe for a few choice encounters. If the art direction reminds you of Destiny, isn't that bad for an action horror game? I don't know. I see the argument, but the visuals did such a great job of conveying the grandness, and I enjoyed them so much it's hard for me to knock them. Dead Space 1 and 2 perfected the horror sci-fi aesthetic, and they satisfied me in that regard. I don't know if I needed another game with that same aesthetic. Dead Space 3 is the finale in the series, and I think that grandness is warranted, and it sets itself apart from its predecessors. I also don't agree with the charge that Dead Space 3 entirely abandons its horror roots. When you're not in these large vistas, you're in dark corridors much like the prior two games, and some of the necromorph designs rank high up there in creepiness. For instance, some of the humanoid enemies' torsos burst into these three-armed appendages, and their appearance is so ungainly that it really creeped me out. The game really sold me on its grandness. When I was flying through the void of space, I really believed I was, in fact, flying through the void of space. When the sky turned blood red, with blotted clouds and a sinister moon, it really felt like the entire universe was at stake. This grandness, I think, is necessary in selling that the entire fate of humanity is dependent on our actions. I don't know if the same small-scale ambient horror would have worked as well for the story Dead Space 3 is telling. Dead Space 3 aims differently than its predecessors, but I think it succeeds in the mood it's trying to set. Whether you think that mood was the right direction for the series is subjective, but for me, it felt right for the conclusion of the series. For some reason in Dead Space 3, I wasn't as drawn to the audio logs or text logs as I was in the other games. When I took the time to listen to them, they generally succeeded in adding to the game's lore and atmosphere. Take the example I gave earlier of the planet's freezing logs, however I just didn't feel the urge to listen to them as much, and I felt a bit impatient as I sat through them. I think this can be attributed to a couple of things. First off, the game makes a design choice that I disagree with. In prior games, you could pick up audio logs and you could listen to them while moving. In Dead Space 3, the audio logs are tied to computer terminals. This means you can't move away when listening to them, and instead have to sit there and listen through. I think this greatly contributed to the restlessness, and I'm not sure why they made this choice. The computer terminals look pretty bulky too, like they're out of the 90s. While I get that this attributes to the game's industrial sci-fi aesthetic, it's still strange that they would have such bulky computer systems in a universe with interstellar travel. I probably wouldn't have thought about this, except for the fact that I had to sit there and stare at these terminals for so dang long. Compounding this issue is the urgency of the game's story. This game's story has a greater thrust than the predecessors, Dead Space 1 especially. In that game, lots of objectives were repairing the terminal or getting a system back on, so you felt a bit more liberty to explore a bit. In Dead Space 3, the game's story is often at a do-or-die state. When you're trying to find your friends, and you're freezing to death after a ship crash, sitting around listening to audio logs doesn't quite feel right, and it sucks some of the immersion away. Lastly, some of my restlessness might come because this is the third game in the series. I've already listened to so many audio logs from the predecessors, so it could be a bit of fatigue. Aside from the logs and art direction, this game also has side missions. I didn't play the co-op missions. Again, I wanted to see what this game had to offer purely as a single player experience, so I didn't mess with them. I did go through about half the side missions though. All the ones I played were dungeon-like experiences, almost reminded me of dungeons in Skyrim. You would explore an area, taking down necromorphs in your way, uncovering more of the side mission story. At the end was usually some form of loot, either in a new weapon or in valuable crafting materials. We'll take the conning tower mission for example. You got a skillless tower, getting through the booby traps a crewmate named Edwards leaves you. The entire time he's talking to you on the comms. When you get to him, however, you find out that he's been dead the entire time, and all of this is pre-recorded audio. He was the last crewmate surviving, but it all felt pointless to him. None of the side missions I played were all too riveting story-wise, but they offered a decent gameplay challenge and succeeded in adding into the world. The world feels bigger by virtue of other people going about their own goals and struggles outside of Isaac and his party's main objectives. However, these side missions sort of run into the same problem as the audio logs. I played most of the early game side missions because the pacing of the game was a tinge slower as you explored the desecrated ship. However, at the end of the game, this story was so urgent that I kept wanting to play through that and not get distracted by other diversions. I think the worst example is the final side mission. After Ellie is seemingly killed by Danik, Isaac goes on his rageful manhunt. All you want to do is capture Danik and stop him from dooming humanity. Then you unlock a side mission to investigate artifact storage. This guy just killed your girlfriend. This same guy is on a mission to ruin humanity. The idea of pausing that to investigate artifact storage does not feel pertinent to the situation. I didn't want to play it for this very reason, so I continued on with the main story. Worse yet, seeing a side mission available notification really takes you out of the story, as it reminds you that you're just playing a game. In this sense, I think the side missions can detract a bit from the main story at times. They grow the world, but they also can feel like distractions. Along with banners like side mission available, There are other times when the new gameplay systems harm immersion. The biggest example is probably crafting. I'll get more in depth with the system later, but for the purposes of immersion, the crafting system feels a bit off. First off is the notifications. You get a little crafting robot that can scavenge materials for you. This is nice since it means you don't always have to scrounge every little material. However, this means that you get a little robot is ready at the crafting station notification that pops up at random intervals. If you're really deeply immersed in a part of the story, or heading down a scary corridor, seeing this notification pop up can take your immersion away pretty quickly. Similarly, hunting around for tungsten to upgrade your flamethrower feels at odds with the urgency of the story. Again, hunting around for raw materials feels at odds with trying to find your friends after a plane crash, who may be dead or dying for all you know. Still, these immersion breaks don't offend me quite as much as if they are in Dead Space 1 or 2. The reason again is because Dead Space 3 is trying to sell you on a sense of grandness and scale rather than pure immersion. And again, because it delivers on that sense of scale and the importance of the main missions, these were far from deal breakers for me. So similarly for the main story, there are great highs and lows with how this game presents itself outside the main narrative. It was still an overall success in my book though. The grand vistas we get to experience were really some of the most memorable that I've experienced in games, and it's hard for me to write that off as any sort of loss. It all comes down to whether you can get on board with the aims of Dead Space 3. If you can buy into the vision, then I think the experience overall is a success. It's time for today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. I'm just kidding, I don't have any sponsors. But I'm going to take the opportunity to plug my post-apocalyptic series Apocalypse Bounty. Part of the reason for the big delay between my first and second retrospectives is because I've been putting the finishing touches on the third novel in the series. I think it's going to be a real treat for you guys. So what's the Northfield Saga about, you ask? The first novel in the Northfield Saga, Apocalypse Bounty, follows the life of Mark Northfield, a lone mercenary operating in the post-apocalypse. His only comfort is the memory of his dead wife, and he lives by two final promises to her: never let go of life, and never let the world turn him into something worse than the man she married. When a vengeful adversary blackmails Northfield into an assassination mission, his hope of keeping both vows shatters. If he refuses to complete the mission, he faces execution. He must either accept his death or corrupt himself. More lies in his decision than in the state of his soul. Unknown to him, his target holds the key to saving the world. The series continues strong with the sequel Stormrise. Stormrise won honorable mentions at the Southern California Book Festival and the New England Book Festival this year. If you like sci-fi and you want a new story to hook you, please check out my series. It's the best way you can support me, as I really think this series can get on the map. With all that said, let's get back to Dead Space 3. Let's talk about combat. Oh man, do I have a lot to say on this one. I'll lay the groundwork first, by talking about how I felt about the first two Dead Space games. I thought Dead Space 1 had just about the perfect combat system for an action horror game. Dead Space 2 polished up a few of the rougher edges around the system, but left it largely untouched. Although I enjoyed it just as much as the first, I felt like they played combat a bit too safe in the sequel. There was nothing that really shook up combat from the first game. Well, you can't criticize Dead Space 3 for making the same mistake. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone criticize Dead Space 3 from the angle that it's too similar to its predecessors. If everyone did that, well, I think we'd be having a different video here today. We'll start with what stays the same from the predecessors. You'll still have the same over-the-shoulder, crunchy third-person shooting with a focus on dismemberment. It's always better to try taking out a necromorph by the knees or arms than shooting it dead in the chest or head. Stasis and kinesis also return. You can pick up necromorph arms and huck them back at your enemies like wholesale daggers. When you're in a hot spot, you can freeze the necromorphs in place to get yourself some breathing room. So, at its bones, Dead Space 3's combat is similar to its predecessors. It's everything that's built atop these bones that has seen wide changes. First off, Isaac has some new movement abilities. He has a combat role now, a staple of third-person shooters. With this defensive ability, you have more options in the face of enemies barreling down your way. Before, you could only hope to take the necromorph down before it reached you, or use a valuable stasis charge. Now though, you can dodge necromorph attacks. This changes the moment-to-moment combat considerably. In the prior games, I was always mindful of spacing. You always wanted space between you and the necromorphs, because as I said, you couldn't dodge their attacks if you got into their clutches. In Dead Space 3, however, I wasn't afraid of closing the distance between me and the necromorphs. Especially as I primarily used a flamethrower, I wasn't afraid of stuffing my barrel right in their faces, and when things got too hot or I saw an attack coming, I could roll out of the way. I really liked the feel of the combat roll, and how it enhanced your options in fights. Watching Isaac dip and duck around really made him feel more like a warrior than an engineer. I think it makes sense though story-wise. This is his third go-around with the necromorphs after all. He's a vet. He's learned how to bob and weave between those arm blades by now. The combat role might be tuned a bit heavily in the player's favor, however. I didn't do extensive testing, but it felt like Isaac was invulnerable during some frames of the role. When a necromorph attacked and I dodged, I never really seemed to get hit, even if the blades scraped over Isaac's shoulder model. Except for the few times where I faced a giant necromorph and got sledgehammered by a 30-foot-long monster arm like a grease and gristle pancake. But generally, the combat roll was a get-out-of-jail-free card. If I rolled, I could count on the fact that I wasn't getting hit. Having this option available took away some of the horror elements of the enemies for me. It's hard to be as scared of enemies when you can dodge, you know? Then again, I never found Dead Space's enemies all that terrifying myself, except maybe the Twitchers and Dividers. So this wasn't that much of a loss to me. Overall, I liked what the combat role brought to the combat. Isaac's other new movement ability is a crouch. You might be thinking to yourself, interesting. Dead Space is a game where you fight appendage-obsessed ghouls in space with a nasty habit of bull rushing you. Why would I ever need to crouch? Well, that leads right into our next topic. There's a new enemy in town, and for what I believe is the first in the series, it isn't the necromorphs. Dead Space 3 pits you against the unitologists. I've got to start just on principle of the idea of adding human enemies to Dead Space. I've seen a lot of recoil against this online. People say, Dead Space is a game about fighting the necromorphs. Throwing humans into the game erodes the game's identity and reduces it to yet another bargain bin third-person shooter. Essentially, the criticism I've heard is that Dead Space 3 was chasing trends, and this is yet another example of that trend, shoehorning standard human-type enemies into a game franchise where they don't fit. I do understand the line of criticism, and I think it's valid in certain cases. Take Destiny or Halo. Both of those games focus on humans fighting alien threats much in the same way as Dead Space. And if the next games in those series plopped a bunch of human enemies in their campaigns, I'd look at them side-eyed. The reason why is that in both of these series, the focus is entirely on posing threats being aliens. You're never really facing down another human faction as a threat. Humanity is united against the common enemy, even if there are squabbles between them and how to accomplish these goals. Now, in the extended lore of the franchises, I'm sure there's tons of human conflicts, and I'm leaving out multiplayer where you do fight other humans because it's not really tied to the main campaign. In the main campaign story, it's always humanity versus another threat. In Dead Space, however, the situation is different. In each game, the Unitologists are a driving antagonist who are diametrically opposed to Isaac and other humans' plans. The Unitologists try to kill Isaac on a number of occasions in each of the prior games. They are an enemy, and they have always been an enemy. So narratively, I think it makes total sense that Isaac would find himself in direct conflict with the Unitologists. In fact, I think you could argue that it's a good payback in a third game. The Unitologists have been trying to kill you since the very first. It's about time they try open combat and see how they fare against Isaac. Now that I've laid down why I don't think their inclusion in the game as an enemy type is sacrilege, let's talk about how they are to fight gameplay-wise. The Unitologists are okay. The mechanics are sound enough. It's not one of those cases where the game's mechanics break when trying to bend around a concept that wasn't designed for. There isn't anything frustrating or broken about fighting them. You have that crouch ability, which I mentioned earlier, which lets you hide behind cover like boxes and vehicles. You can even pop above cover with your gun and shoot. It's a little on the clunky side, especially because I couldn't find a way to swap Isaac's shoulders when shooting, but it gets the job done. The best part I think about fighting them is the voice chatter. The Unitologists sound very real when you're fighting them, barking orders and status updates based on the combat situation. It's really convincing, and it reminds me a lot of Fear actually. When I compare anything to Fear gameplay-wise, especially with enemy design, that's a pretty big compliment. Overall though, I can't disagree with the critics that the combat against the Unitologists is pretty generic. It doesn't beat any third-person shooter made around fighting human-like combatants, that's for sure. Gears of War or Division aren't going to be run for their money. Yet, I do think that these conflicts, although they're generic, do well for the game's pacing. Getting a break from fighting necromorphs and injecting a bit of variety is nice in my opinion, as the human conflict is pretty sparingly used. You get a lot of it in the first chapter or so, which is pretty jarring to be honest, and I think probably a reason for why it sparks so much hate. But then you don't see much human combat until far later in the game near its conclusion. But let's get back to the necromorphs. How are they to fight in this game? They're good, but not as good as Dead Space 1 or 2. The main reason comes to, funnily enough, variety. Almost all the necromorphs from Dead Space 1 and 2 returned to Dead Space 3, along with a couple of new ones thrown into the mix. I didn't do an exact headcount, but I would hazard to guess that Dead Space 3 has the most enemy types out of the three main games, or at least pretty darn close. So you'd think Dead Space 3 would have the best variety by default, right? Game, set, and match. Score 1 for Dead Space 3. Well, not exactly. One of the best parts about Dead Space 1 was how it used each enemy type. The game treated each enemy like a different chess piece. They each had their strengths and weaknesses and specific strategies to counteract. The real magic came in how the games would constantly vary which enemies you faced in an encounter. Each combination of enemies presented a unique challenge, and each combat encounter felt unique as a result. Dead Space 2 accomplished a similar end with its variety. Dead Space 3 has those same chess pieces, but it seems reluctant to use them. So many fights were against just the base necromorphs, and a new enemy type that looks like a bargain bin zombie with pitchforks. Fighting this enemy type feels similar too. It's a humanoid that you need to shoot out with legs or arms. The unique necromorph types, like the pregnants or twitchers, appear less often. It felt like only the last handful of chapters where I even saw these necromorphs. As a result, a lot of the fights feel samey and not unique, which is a real shame. Again, all the chess pieces are there, it just seems like the game doesn't use them. The variety still is better than a lot of games I've played, but I'm not sure why Dead Space 3 doesn't use its enemies to the same great effect as the prior games. Along with the standard enemies, Dead Space 3 has a handful of boss encounters. The first is the Snow Beast, a giant quadrupedal that's favorite hobby is bull rushing you. My initial strategy was to dodge roll past his attacks, Dark Souls style. Unfortunately, this did not work even slightly, and I died a handful of times before he got that through my head. The best strategy I found was to keep my distance, blasting the boss repeatedly with stasis so he didn't have the chance of charging me. The way to damage this guy is to shoot out the glowy appendages that protrude from his mouth. I felt somewhat mad about this guy. The fight with him does manage to be a spectacle, and shooting out the appendages does feel satisfying. The thing is though, they just grow right on back. There isn't a lot of great feedback of progress with this fight. You just keep shooting out the appendages without any clue of how much health the boss has left. Along with that, he has a bit too much health, which paired with the lack of indication makes this fight feel slightly samey. I don't think I would comment on the sameness, except for the fact you fight this guy 3 times in the campaign. By the 3rd time, the fight really started to feel routine, which is the last thing you want a boss to feel like. The whole point of a boss is to be the opposite of routine, to break up the routine battles with standard enemies. He is mechanically sound though. The danger of the charge and the difficulty of avoiding it gave the fight a different flow than most in the game. I'd say he's pretty good, but not great. Another boss, I guess you could call it that, is against a big drill. Since you have to stasis the drill and blow out its center to disable it. Meanwhile, you have to fend off necromorphs. It isn't exactly a mechanically deep boss, but the spectacle is definitely there. Honestly, when I was sprinting away as the drill is grinding just at my heels, I felt a palpable anxiety. It's a good encounter, but I'm glad they didn't repeat it. The magic of this fight is that it only occurs once. The next boss is the Nexus. This is my favorite fight in the series. It's like an upgraded version of the final hive mind boss from the first game. On paper, the fight is pretty simple. Blast out the Nexus' glowing sacks as you dodge its attacks and bat away necromorphs. What makes this fight special is a couple of things. The first is the spectacle. This fight has the most spectacle in the series, save perhaps the final boss of this game. You've got the backdrop of a blood-red dying sky, and you've got this giant beast you have to slay. By the end of the fight, you're sucked into the Nexus' stomach, having to blast your way out. How metal is that? Secondly, this fight just clicks with Dead Space 3's mechanics. The Nexus slams its tentacles down on you, but unlike the first game where your only recourse was to sprint away, in Dead Space 3 you have your dodge roll. As such, the developers could make the tentacles a lot harder to avoid by just running away. The tentacles target you a lot more accurately, so you have to dodge more often. And the feeling of narrowly dodging this beast's attack to then get back on your feet and blast away is a thrilling experience. It's a fight of constant movement, but also constant aggression. The fight doesn't stay past its welcome, but it lasts long enough to feel meaningful. So yeah, long story short, I enjoyed this one. That leaves the final boss, the Moon. This fight might take the cake for having the most spectacle. I mean, you're picking up giant markers, the objects of all the calamity and strife in the series, and hucking them as spears at the freaking moon. Need I say more? The fight itself isn't special though. Aside from throwing the markers, you're essentially just fighting off waves of necromorphs as you avoid debris landing around the arena. It's not frustrating by any means, but I wish this fight had been as involved as the Nexus fight. Overall, it's a decent way of ending the game, and I wasn't let down, just for that spectacle factor. I've reserved an entire section of this video for probably the most controversial change in this game, weapon crafting. I'll start with how the weapons used to work. In Dead Space 1 and 2, there were a relatively small selection of weapons, but they were all really unique and iconic. They all had a primary and alternate fire mode. For instance, you had the classic plasma cutter, which shot a small horizontal projectile, which then could be switched to vertical cuts to better rend off necromorph limbs. You had the Ripper, which could shoot out a buzzsaw that would levitate in front of you for easy sawing. Or, you could use its alternate fire to blast the buzzsaw forward, which go ping-ponging around and slicing up necromorphs along the journey. Or you have the pulse rifle, a chattering machine gun with a grenade launcher as its alternate fire. I could go on and on. The point is, the weapon selection had a very curated and intentional feel to it. Each weapon had its place in the greater sandbox, great for specific purposes, but lacking in others. They also had a lot of character, feeling in place in this mechanized future where Isaac is struggling to get by with whatever tools he can grab. Dead Space 3 gets rid of this weapon design, instead introducing a weapon crafting system. Most of the old weapons can be crafted in one form or another, but in a broad sense, this is opening Pandora's box for players. Using the system, you can craft pretty much any tool of death you desire. I'll describe the system in an abbreviated version. There's a whole spread of materials that can be found throughout the environment. Tungsten, iron, etc. These materials can then be crafted in different parts for a weapon. The first part to craft is the handle, which can be one or two-handed. Think of a pistol versus a rifle. Different weapon options open up after you choose a handle. The next part is to craft top and bottom weapons. The top weapon will be your primary fire, and your bottom weapon will be your secondary fire. So take the plasma rifle from the first game. Your primary fire is a machine gun, and your secondary fire is a grenade launcher. Well, with this new crafting system, if you strap an automatic weapon to your top rail and a grenade launcher on your bottom rail, then you've created a similar gun. Alternately though, you could strap a flamethrower on the bottom. Then you can add on top of that alternate mods, like making your projectiles spew acid or shock enemies. Top it all off with stat upgrades with circuits like increased damage or reload, and you have the crafting system in a nutshell. Although it may not sound like a big deal, I think this really is the biggest change the series has seen mechanics-wise. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, it's probably the most hated change that the series has made. Let me start off by explaining the reasons people despise the system so heavily in no particular order. First off, the crafting system is just overwhelming from the offset. You're given this menu with so many options, and it's not exactly clear how they intertwine with each other. Dead Space is a horror shooter, not an RPG. The old weapons had a great pick up and use feel to them, and now we're supposed to number crunch at a terminal? It feels at odds with the series and isn't what a lot of players are looking for. They don't want an in-depth crafting system in a game like this. Secondly, this introduces resource grinding into the game. Now instead of focusing on the environments or log nodes, players feel like they have to instead be hunting down for the last 10 tungsten they need to strap a new barrel onto their assault rifle. Likewise, sending a crafting bot to sniff out iron for you while your friends are dead and dying is an immersion killer. Overall, it makes the game feel more gamey, and it's harder to get sucked into the world. In addition, finding materials is just a tedious activity. And again, for a linear, fast-paced horror survival game, this tedium feels out of place. In addition, crafting has some weird effects on other game systems. For instance, because there's an uncountable number of weapons players can create, all weapons share the same ammo pool. This contrasts with older games where you might have 25 flamer fuel and 50 pulse rifle rounds. There are a number of problems with this change. First off, it kills variety. Since all weapons share the same ammo, you can always rely on your favorite weapon now. Secondly, the ammo system is vague. You usually loot 5 clips from enemies, but what does 5 clips even mean? It's different for every weapon, so I never really had a good gauge on how much ammunition I had, unless I explicitly checked my weapon. In the prior games, I knew exactly what 25 pulse rifle rounds meant without having to do any deep thinking. Last is the biggest issue people have with the system. You see, these crafting materials aren't only obtainable from playing the game. If you have your wallet nice and ready, you can buy materials with real money. There are microtransactions in this game, primarily fueled by the crafting system. Spending money cuts down having to grind for these materials yourself. A lot of people see this system as a predatory monetary system, designed not for the player's fun, but instead for nickel and diming. I could belabor this point, but I think you intuitively get why people would have a problem with a system like this. I could go on, and I'm sure there's a couple complaints people have that I've missed. Still, I think that's the general thrust of why people hate these systems so much. But you know what? Even with all these issues, I like the crafting system. It's heresy, I know. Before you get your pitchforks out, let me at least explain why I liked it. If you watched my prior Dead Space reviews, you know that I wasn't a fan of the old upgrade system. With that system, you would upgrade your weapons with power nodes that you scavenged from the environment or bought with credits. You'd upgrade your weapon's base stats, but not much more than that. I won't go over every reason I didn't like it here, but I think it can be summed up by one word: unsatisfying. The stats were oftentimes vague, like +1 damage. What does +1 damage mean? So even though the upgrades were helpful and definitely stacked up by the game's end, each individual upgrade didn't feel all that meaningful. I won't even get into the blank nodes. In the end, even though the system was perfectly functional, I didn't have much fun with it. The upgrades didn't change your weapon's behavior in any meaningful way or altered how you approach combat. At the end of my Dead Space 2 video, I asked for a meaningful change of the system, and I certainly got that here. Maybe I should just end this section at this point. Beggars shouldn't be choosers, right? In contrast, the upgrades in Dead Space 3 feel meaningful. If I strap an arc beam onto the bottom of my shotgun, the weapon's behavior has now changed, and so has my approach to combat. My shotgun would now have a long-range option via my brand new arc beam, which means I can take some fights at range now that I may otherwise have had to close the distance or switch to a different weapon. If unitologists are taking pot shots at me with a rocket launcher from a rooftop, I now can hit them with my weapon. That's a real change to gameplay. To me, that's exciting. I can't lie, I had so much fun experimenting with different setups and seeing what worked the best. At the beginning of the game, I had a plasma cutter and crappy automatic pistol. By the end of the game, I had a flamethrower with a giant tank of ammo, with an arc emitter at the bottom that shoots bolts of electricity like a sniper. On top of that, the projectiles for both spewed acid. As a secondary, I had a military assault rifle that shot electric rounds and a nail-shooting shotgun on the bottom. I mean, I think that itself speaks for how the progression of weapons feels. There's a huge gameplay incentive to push on ahead, and I actively looked forward to what new unlocks I could get for my guns. The crafting system, although initially is overwhelming, is actually pretty straightforward and easy once you get to spend a little time with it. This is coming from someone who never crafts in games. I always find the system so obtuse, and the thought of traipsing around the fields for some stupid flower or rock I need sounds nauseating. So the fact that I managed to buy into Dead Space 3's crafting system and understand it speaks volumes. I didn't even need to look up guides on how the crafting works. And although you do pick up a lot of crafting materials yourselves, the little crafting bot you're given helps. When you hear a noise indicator, you can drop the bot down. It will go and gather materials for you, and that's how I got the bulk of mine. It's a pretty hands-off experience. I also think the crafting system fits in the game fairly well from a narrative point of view. Aside from my points about crafting in high-stress situations breaking immersion and feeling weird, crafting weapons is very in line for Isaac's character. He's an engineer after all. In the first game, almost all of his weapons were initially tools that had other intended uses. So, by the third game, it's a nice development that the engineer is now building out his own tools to fight the necromorph horde. The crafting system also gives a way for players to express themselves. The guns I build out are probably not what you ended up building. I feel like this builds a connection between you and Isaac. It's a step into his shoes as the engineer. These weapons are both his creations from a story perspective, but they're also yours. The crafting system results in 2 less weapon slots for you. In the prior games, you could carry 4 weapons at once. A lot of people didn't like this change. However, my weapons had such functionality, and I built them to take on almost all combat scenarios, so I didn't miss these 2 slots all that much. Okay, so I like the crafting system from a gameplay perspective. I think it fits well enough from a narrative perspective too. Let's move to the most egregious criticism of the system, that it is predatory and designed to make players spend real-world money and not be fun. While there are notifications and offers to buy crafting materials, is buying them really necessary? During the first hour or 2 of the game, the system really did worry me in this regard. Materials came by rarely, especially the rare types, and it felt like I wouldn't be able to build out all the weapons I wanted to. As the game went on, however, this worry started to fade for me. In fact, I wonder why buying crafting materials is even an option. By chapter 12 of 19 in total, I had already crafted my 2 main weapons with every single advanced upgrade that I wanted for them. In fact, for reasons I'll get into in a second, I actually recrafted my most resource-heavy advanced gun all over again, and then still had an overflow of materials I didn't really have much to spend on. For the rest of the game, I only got suit upgrades like health and stasis. Honestly, not sure what reason someone would feel the need to buy crafting materials, because by the end of the game, you have multiple crafting bots to deploy, and they pick up rare materials at a swift pace. There's one section of the game where I felt completely screwed over though. It relates to me having to recraft my most prized weapon all over again. At one point in the game, around the chapter 12-ish mark, you have to craft a harpoon gun, which is specifically required for the story. You have to go to a crafting station to equip it. When you activate the crafting station, you have to replace one of your 2 main weapons with the harpoon gun. You don't have any way backing out, not that I could tell. This part comes pretty much without warning too. I placed the harpoon gun in my acid flamethrower slot, and then the game just deleted my acid flamethrower. This weapon, which I had spent the last 6 hours building out, just wiped from my inventory. I didn't even get the raw materials back. I couldn't believe it. I don't think there's another time in a game that I've just felt so completely screwed over. Fortunately, when the time came to unequip the harpoon gun, a chapter or so later, I had more than enough materials to recraft my flamethrower and all its upgrades all over again. It's such an egregious oversight. I could almost see it as an intentional design decision to make players despair about their favorite weapon disappearing, so they buy crafting materials to rebuild it. After some thinking, I don't think this was the case though. I had more than enough materials to craft my weapon again, no sweat. Still, this was a bad oversight, and it still leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. Aside from that hiccup though, I found the crafting system incredibly rewarding and fun, despite all the very valid problems with it. I think it adds an immense amount of replay value to the game. After beating it one time, I wanted to hop right back in to try building a new setup of weapons, like a kitted out plasma cutter or ripper. Dead Space 3's gameplay outside of combat is pretty similar to its predecessor Dead Space 2. Zero gravity and vacuum space return. The main difference with these mechanics in Dead Space 3 is the scale, especially in the earlier chapters of the game. When you're investigating the derelict ship, Isaac has a huge amount of space, no pun intended, to move around in. He can freely travel between different ships, landing and taking off as he sees fit. It really sells you on your role as a space explorer. In addition, although the zero-G controls are their smoothest yet, they're still relatively clunky, so having larger areas to move around in helps hide the clunkiness, as you don't often have to make precise movements. Because of this, I rarely felt at odds with the game's controls, and I generally enjoy the zero-G sections, which, based on how much I hated these sections in Dead Space 1, is a pretty big achievement. The vacuum areas, where Isaac has a limited amount of oxygen and dies if the timer reaches zero, see much more restrictive use. Isaac barely has to contend with no oxygen unless he's also exploring the vacuum of space. This contrasts from its predecessors, where you often would lack oxygen even in areas where zero-G wasn't used. Overall, I think its more limited use is fine for this game. It was never a mechanic I thought added a whole lot to the game, and I felt like Dead Space 1 and 2 had already utilized the mechanic to its full extent. Belaboring on the vacuum mechanic would have felt like a retread of old ground. The level design is another highlight for me. It's a nice evolution of the design approach in both Dead Space 1 and 2. Both predecessors differed greatly in their level design. Dead Space 1 had cordoned off levels, but they were pretty labyrinthian in design. Isaac would have to navigate around the spaces, finding keys and the like, often backtracking and uncovering new ways to advance. This gave the player an intimacy with the locations, and they ended up being pretty memorable as a result. One drawback, though, is that levels were bookended with Isaac getting on and off a tram, so their structure as a cohesive whole felt a bit contrived. When you got on the tram for the 9th time, it felt a bit gamey. Dead Space 2 levels were very linear, with Isaac always moving constantly forward. There wasn't the same problem with repetitive transitions between levels, but Dead Space 2 lost the intimacy the player had with the levels. Because you're always moving forward, the levels sort of blurred together, and they didn't have the same character that Dead Space 1 areas had due to their interwoven structure. I think Dead Space 3 finds the perfect balance between the approaches. Aside from the linear starts and ends to the game, Dead Space 3 is broken into two large areas, the ruined ships orbiting Tal Volantis, and the surface area of the planet itself. A handful of chapters span each of the locations. As such, each location is a hub of sorts, as Isaac explores their depths and backtracks through them. As a result, you end up with the character and familiarity with the levels found in Dead Space, but not the repetition and contrived nature due to the presence of so many levels. I think the art design of each location greatly helps. As I mentioned to a fault, the grandiose nature of both the void of space, when navigating between the carcasses of ships, and the apocalyptic frozen hellscape of the planet were great highlights for me. Overall, I thought they were a joy to explore. Minigames returned from Dead Space 2. Mercifully, there's more than one minigame this time, so there's some variety at least. Unfortunately, none of the minigames are all too interesting. For instance, one of the minigames is shifting your mouse and movement keys around to highlighted nodes. It's not at all hard or stimulating. However, none of the games were all too frustrating. They didn't add or detract from the game for me, and I don't have much to say about them. They're pretty take it or leave it. More elaborate puzzles turn, such as assembling Rosetta, but these are pretty far and wide. It's a far cry from the days of Dead Space 1, when nearly every chapter contained a puzzle. This is just fine by my approximation. Again, I've never adored the puzzles in action-oriented games, so I'm not exactly shedding tears at their reduced use. A new activity is introduced in the form of rappel ropes. These are pretty sparingly used until the later chapters of the game, and I think their addition spiced up gameplay well enough. They weren't overused, so I don't find myself frustrated by them, even though in one section I probably died 6 or 7 times. I think the highlight of this mechanic is at the end of the game. You're hounding down Danik, blitzing on a wall like a Spider-Man with one too many shots of Red Bull, blasting away at Danik and his cronies. It manages to be an adrenaline-inducing moment, which perfectly captures the energy of the moment and Isaac's anger-fueled state. I guess I'd say overall, between the minigames and puzzles, zero-G and rappelling, the pacing of the game felt right. The base combat kept me engaged enough, and there's enough variety through these secondary game features that I never felt like the game was becoming an endless slog of enemies. I didn't tire of combat, nor get frustrated by the secondary elements. So overall, I commend the game for its pacing, and I think it might be the best out of the series from this sense. Dead Space 3, the saga of a game dumbed down and compromised for casuals. The game that anchored the series in a frozen abyss until the recent remake. Maybe I'm just the mouth-breathing casual this game was after, but I don't agree with this narrative. I had the strongest urge to replay Dead Space 3 out of all the games in the series. I wanted to see those vistas again. I wanted to see the end to Isaac's story once more. I wanted to mess around with the crafting system and see what other liabilities for war crimes I could create. I wanted to hop back in and crush more necromorphs, dodge rolling from their swipes like an aluminum can tumbling down the highway. Might be the most unpolished of the 3 games in terms of vision. It might be the most bumpy. But even through it all, I had a great fondness for this game that rivals the prior 2 games. I know I'm in the minority, and I know my taste will be questioned, but I just have to honestly say I enjoyed this game. I don't think it deserves to be forgotten or thrown into the trash. And if I'm the only one, well, you'll probably see me in 10 years digging through the trash that people have thrown their copies into, pulling Dead Space 3 out to play again once more. That's all I've got today. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, especially if you disagreed with me. This is Kelvin B. Fisher signing off. Until next time.